In episode 7 through 9 of Single Drunk Female, we go into Sam heading to New York and realizing that her dreams might be a bit bigger than what Nathaniel has to offer. We also go into in episode 8 James's backstory, specifically the day he met Sam. And then episode 9 talks about Sam's first year of being sober and showing us one of the characters unfortunately relapsing. So to begin with episode 7 is Sam going to New York, and it's best to start things off with what's happening in Boston before we get to New York. So let's just begin with the storyline that has really nothing to do with anything else, and that's Stefani, and Olivia having a bit of issues when it comes to having a baby. Now, to keep a medium-sized story short, Stefani feels that Olivia is not as invested as she is, and on top of that, they're having issues when it comes to finding a sperm donor, and it's just a lot for Stefani on top of the stuff that's being done with the house and all that's going on with her business. So considering all that her wife is going through stress-wise, Olivia decides she's going to start taking the hormones and she's going to actually carry the baby. And with that, it seems things might get a little bit better, but based off what we see in episode 9, it doesn't seem that taking those hormones and everything is really Olivia's bag. But more on that later. Getting to a topic that starts to go into Sam going to New York, there's Bob and Carol who are in a good place, but Carol gets a little uncomfortable with Bob giving Sam money to go to New York. I think he gave her maybe around $100, maybe less. Either way, with him not just dating her in that action, but now kind of being a parental figure to Sam, that forces her to realize that it's not just her that's moving on, but potentially Sam, and this is more and more making her husband truly someone who has passed on. And the dead can never be replaced, but their position definitely can be filled in. While Sam is not really like freaking out or nothing about it, since she doesn't seem to know that Bob put the money in her purse, Carol is definitely taking on that feeling for the both of them. But luckily for her, money's not really a big thing for Sam, because right now she's just enjoying her time in New York with James. And when it comes to her meeting Nathaniel, at first the meeting is good. He's pitching her doing these things on local theaters and all that, but then he switches and says, oh, you're actually going to be covering parties and things of that nature. And with Sam remembering all that stuff Olivia talked about when it comes to triggers, and honestly feeling like she might have outgrown what Nathaniel can offer her, she seems to say, nah, I'm good. And with that, she just focuses on meeting up with James at the bus going back to Boston. But unlike her, James does pretty well with what he's doing. He sells his sobriety app, and while you think that would be a major thing for him, he's kind of stone-faced about it, if not shocked. And it even pushes you to understand what we see in a few episodes later regarding why he's like that, since it seems success for him really fosters imposter syndrome. And with that, it seems that he can't be joyful in moments like that because he's kind of questioning if it's real, or maybe taking note of what we see in Super Pumped, sort of feeling like at any moment somebody may try to take this from him. Super Pumped being the show that's on Showtime, which we would do videos on, but I don't think we're going to watch anymore, but that's a whole different story. In episode 8, we go back into the past and see James when he was a serious drunk. But strange enough, only Lucas, his older brother, really calls him out on it or even speaks on it. Meanwhile, when it comes to the rest of James's family, whether if it's his mother or his father, maybe even the rest of his family, they pretty much don't say nothing. They just focus on him being this big-time coder, him going to MIT or some other fancy tech school. And because of that, it seems him getting a DUI and all these other issues that he has, nobody pays any mind to it. But Sam does, even though she's as much of a drunk as he is. Because The two meet at Good Time Sally's and they meet Ronnie. Well, James probably meets Ronnie. Sam knows Ronnie for a long time, especially because she keeps having sex in the bathroom and breaking the toilet paper dispenser. And it's because of them having sex and then breaking that dispenser that that those two end up spending most of the day and night together, and they really have a good date. I'm talking they have conversations about family, about the aforementioned imposter syndrome, and you would think that after that date it would either become like a romantic comedy thing where they meet every Thanksgiving, or maybe they would just keep in touch because they found someone who really gets it and connects. But the problem is while the date goes good for the most part, then it gets real dark toward the end when James starts to show suicidal tendencies or thoughts. And with that, he kind of scares Sam off a little bit and makes it seem that while Sam definitely has a drinking problem regarding, her seeing it as a crutch for work and for partying, maybe even to loosen up in order to talk to people like James, with James, it's a whole other issue, and it's the kind that is definitely, what's the proper term for it? Destructive. That's it. Sam may get inebriated to the point where it takes the fun out of the situation because she's gone a little bit too far. But when it comes to James, he's definitely like using alcohol as a substance to deal with dark emotional and mental issues that usually he seems to be able to hide, but that 2 year bender definitely wasn't just about him wanting to loosen up and have a bit more fun in his life. Though I should note, we still don't really know why he started drinking like that. I mean, granted, noted imposter syndrome, but who introduced him to alcohol and all that? It's not really known unless it was those roommates that we saw him play beer pong with Mindy, assuming they knew him back then. So the last episode we're going to talk about is episode 9, and to begin, after Carol's little comments about Joel, it seems that Britt is really starting to think that she really want to marry this man. He buys a plot of land with no house on it, talks about how he's going to build it, they're going to have children, yada yada, and she's kind of not on the same wavelength. Joel is talking about kids soon, and Britt, on the other hand, is talking about a fellowship, becoming a doctor somewhere, and it may not be in the Boston area. So with that, you can see there's definitely some communication problems in their relationship, and Britt even goes so far to contact Felicia to get drugs in order to possibly help clear things up for her. Because at this point, I would say that Britt is in that mindset where she wants validation of possibly dropping Joel rather than opinions on why she shouldn't do it. Which leads us over to Sam, who has now been a year sober. But one thing that Carol notices, partly because of how much she's crying because of all of the hormones she's injecting herself with, is that Carol wasn't invited to the Club 24/7 party regarding Sam's sobriety. With that, Sam makes it clear that she has not reconciled with Carol in that way, and I guess because we don't see her, she hasn't reconciled with Britt that way too, but it's hard to say because these time jumps make us miss so much information, but that'll be covered in a bit. Anyway, so with Olivia talking about that, Sam decides she's going to talk to Carol, and Carol decides in the moment that Sam approaches her, we're going to wait, do it this afternoon, and Carol decides, you know what, let's combine this into a giant talk that we need to have. The talk includes Bob moving in, Sam and Carol scattering Carol's husband, Sam's dad's ashes, and then them both taking responsibility for what part they played in each other's lives. Whether it's Sam being a bit of a monster for 13 years as a kid, or you can even say Carol owning up to the fact that she probably wasn't the nicest person who said the right things all the time. And maybe not, that contributed to Sam's drinking. Either way, Carol wants to own her stuff just as much as Sam does. And with that, it seems they may have closed a chapter on the issues of the relationship and may be starting a new one, especially since Sam is talking about moving out. But being that we're not showing any signs that she maybe took a different job besides the Nathaniel one that was offered, or that she's no longer working under Mindy, there comes the question of where's she gonna move to and what money, unless she planned to move in with James, since those two are now actively having sex. And I don't know if they're dating, but they're definitely close. And she spends the day in his bed, so who knows? Maybe that was the plan, that she would move in with him, since, with him making so much money now, it seems like he has his own place, and her moving in, getting herself together, maybe finally tapping into Olivia as part of her network could lead to something. But while Sam may have hopes for that, James is drinking again. In fact, he's even drinking with Joel, which is kind of awkward since, there's a good chance that Sam may take James as her +1 to Britt's wedding. And with that, you kind of can see the awkwardness of a drunk James possibly yelling and acting up, as we saw he's capable of in episode 8, and him noting how Joe had second thoughts about Britt, especially because she wasn't excited about his little plot of land that he bought. Add in Britt having her second thoughts about it, and that wedding's gonna be dramatic and ghetto. So in terms of highlights, the first highlight for us is just Sam realizing what Nathaniel has to offer may have been good enough for when she had an alcohol issue, but now as a sober person, it could be considered beneath her. To go into more detail about what happened in episode 7, what we're told by Nathaniel is that Sam's piece that she was writing while James was resting on her shoulder, it was really good, but it was way beyond whatever place that Nathaniel was looking for. It wasn't Buzz, but it was some type of weird named company. And in my mind, that kind of shows that the Sam who was drinking and used that as a crutch, she was perfect for what Nathaniel needed, because she was able to do quick articles that didn't require much thought, that were fun, fluffy, and possibly forgettable. But sober Sam is the one who truly is more in line with who Olivia is, who has thought-provoking essays, ones that really dig deep into some type of personal story. And while we don't know where Sam may work in order to make money off of this type of writing, at the very least, we get the idea that she's definitely a completely different person now, who knows her worth, who isn't perhaps desperate in order to make ends meet and get out of Carol's house. And with that, she has to really consider who she is without alcohol, beyond who she is when she's not partying, when she's not trying to date, but who she is professionally when she isn't trying to use alcohol as a crutch, the same way that Nat King Cole would use cigarettes in order to keep his voice smooth, or at least in his mind, keep his voice smooth. The next highlight is just how they showcase Olivia and Stefani's issues with being a queer couple that are trying to have a kid. It's something that, in my viewing history, isn't something that's really shown a lot. I think the only other thing that comes to mind is the Fosters offhand. But one of the things that Olivia and Stefani present is the issue of taking hormones in order to get yourself ready and all that makes you go through. On top of that, you have the issue of, you gotta find a donor, and how awkward is that to find a man based off of a picture in a simple blog, and that's gonna be the person you choose to raise. Well, he's not gonna raise the kid, but he's gonna give the product sperm in order to make the kid who you're dealing with and raising for the next 18 years. And also, you have to think about what Olivia said about how weird it is to bring a third party into your marriage or relationship who's a complete stranger, all for the sake of this one thing, and then they exit. Yet, to add on to what probably goes unsaid, you also have to figure that sooner or later this kid's going to ask about who my dad is, what did I get from them, and dealing with all the complications of being two mothers who may be loving, nurturing, everything this kid may need financially, but when it comes to culture, some elements of his social upbringing or her social upbringing, there's this missing piece that you have to acknowledge and possibly deal with if it's an open situation or if it's a closed sperm donor situation. Having that child deal with the fact that there's a missing piece of them that's never going to get put, that's never going to get filled. So the last highlight is just Carol's long recovery, which, granted, like a lot of things, is done off screen, but just seeing her deal with the steps of dating again with Bob and being comfortable with being intimate with him, then getting to the part of her, dealing with the fact that Bob is not just her person, but also is going to be in Sam's life in a major way, and then coming to in episode 9, letting go of her husband's ashes and having Bob move in. While we don't get to see everything, you can definitely tell that there's a lot changing for Carol, and while the show doesn't tap into it like it could, we get glimpses of how this is emotionally and mentally kind of affecting her, and be it that she doesn't have notable friendships and her relationship with Sam is kind of iffy, you can understand that she's taking a lot of this on her own, and with trying to bond with Sam in episode 9, trying to own her stuff and allow Sam to finish the coming of age process in terms of Carol showing who she is fully and admitting her faults, you can see Bob's full influence over her. And again, it makes you kind of wonder, when it comes to Sam's dad, what was he like when it comes to Carol, and a bunch of other questions, which, if we ever do a season review, I can already tell you it's going to be either on the fence or a low point. Speaking of low points, I think a low point for me at this point is just Mindy becoming a background character who kind of pops up, but they don't really utilize. And that's just an issue for me because, it seemed like her and James had something good going, even if it was just a close friendship, but she's pretty much gotten cutting out of James's life. Or, look at it this way, because of that time jump, we don't know if maybe when James was starting to falter, if she possibly tried to help or he came to her. All we know is that James and Sam are now messing around. Mindy's still working at Sam's job, and that's it. And it's disappointing in so many ways. And that leads us to the on defense topic, which is just James's relapse. And the reason it's on defense for us is because the positives of it is, some character was going to relapse. And out of all the characters, James was probably the easiest target. Yet at the same time, they spent the whole episode building this up to him relapsing. So it's kind of like, you set us up for this. I don't know if I really appreciate it, because it's one of those things where, it's an obligation. It's not something that you wanted to see from her. It's not something you wanted to see from James. It's not something you probably want to see from any character. And it almost makes you feel, since James is probably one of the first people we really got to see at their worst besides Sam, does this mean when we see Olivia and what happened to her when she was at her worst, when we see Mindy when she was at her worst, should we soon expect them to relapse after that, since they want to double down on them and invest in them in ways that often the show doesn't when it comes to its characters, especially outside Sam? All I know is, I just don't want James to be the first of many, and I definitely don't want James to be the one that breaks Sam's sobriety. If anything, it would be interesting to see Sam move on from James just because she cares more about her sobriety than James's love, affection, and some consistent